Welcome back. So now we'll go through several different factors in cultural, legal, political, economic, socio-demographic evidence of oppression. First, we'll begin with cultural evidence of oppression. What we've seen is this concept of a racial contract that has existed between whites and persons who were colonized by European powers since the 18th century. It continues to play out today. Under this so-called contract, humans are divided into two groups, whites and non-whites. The latter are given inferior moral status and subordinate civil standing and are subject to various forms of discrimination, including employment and housing. In the case of African Americans, this subordinate status was originally maintained through slavery. Currently, other measures are used to enforce this contract, which includes the police and the penal system. This racial contract is one way to explain the ongoing police brutality to African Americans, as well as the uneven application of the death penalty to whites and African Americans. From economic evidence of oppression, the most startling statistic I think that showcases this oppression is the wealth inequality between white households and African American households. Going back to 1989, you see this wide gap that exists, and it gets even wider in times of economic gain. So when we had the boom in the 90s, some positive traction in the 2000s, we see that white households increase in wealth, where African Americans do not see the same rate of increase. You also see a very stark difference between what the average household wealth is for white families, white households. You're looking at roughly 150,000 over that spectrum, 1989 to 2016. You see for African Americans, that number's hovering closer to $10,000 for an entire household. There are several factors that exacerbate this vicious cycle of wealth inequality. You see in African American households far less access to tax advantages. This is due in part to a long history of employment discrimination and other discriminatory practices. There's a well-documented history of mortgage market discrimination, redlining, and that gave African Americans significantly less opportunity to become a homeowner than a white counterpart. This meant that they had less access to savings and tax benefits that come with owning a home. Persistent labor market discrimination, segregation also forced African Americans into fewer and less advantageous employment opportunities than their white counterparts, and thus African Americans have less access to stable jobs, good wages, and retirement benefits at work. And under the current tax code, families with higher incomes received increased tax incentives associated with both housing and retirement savings. Because African Americans tend to have lower incomes, they inevitably receive fewer tax benefits. Even if they're homeowners or have retirement savings accounts, the bottom line is that persistent housing and labor market discrimination and segregation worsen the damaging cycle of wealth inequality. From an employment perspective, African Americans are twice as likely to be unemployed as whites, and the wages of both African Americans continue to lag well behind those of whites. There have been experimental audit studies that focus on hiring decisions and consistently find strong evidence of racial discrimination. One study in particular by Bertrand and Mullin-Nathan in 2004, researchers mailed equivalent resumes to employers in Boston and Chicago using racially identifiable names to signal race. For example, names like Jamal or Lakeisha signal African American, while Brad and Emily are more associated with the white population. White names triggered a callback rate that was 50% higher than that of equally qualified Black applicants. Further, their study indicated that improving the qualifications of applicants benefited white applicants but not African Americans, thus leading to a wider racial gap in response rates for those with higher skill. There's political evidence of oppression since 1960. There's a study performed by Lane Kenworthy that shows what the political climate is. We see some progress. You see since 1970 there's an increased rate of whites that say they would vote for a qualified African American president, and indeed we saw that play out in 2008 and again in 2012. About 3/4 said they'd be willing to live in a half African American or half Black neighborhood. And then a sizable majority say they oppose housing discrimination, and they also went a step further and said that they do not think that African Americans are lazy. The one most troubling line here is the very bottom one, the one that's closest to 25% in 2012. And that is that less than a quarter of the white population that was surveyed thought that it would be okay for a close relative to marry an African American. This signals that there's still some mindset that somehow the color of one's skin makes them different, and somehow that also means they're somehow inferior. If you want to see the political evidence of oppression since 1960, just take a look at our Congress. You can see that although the 115th Congress is one of the most diverse in U.S. history, less than a fifth of its seats are filled by women or racial and ethnic minorities. And America's state legislatures do little better. Chairs from both parties view African American and Latino candidates as significantly less viable than white candidates, and the minority disadvantage is quite large. On average, chairs are about 10 percentage points less likely to see a candidate who is African American or Latino as the more likely of a pair of candidates to win a primary election compared to their expectation for white candidates. What we're seeing is there is not representation that is equal to the demographics of our community. From a socio-demographic perspective, there are several grids that you can point to that show evidence of oppression since 1960. African Americans are behind, from poverty rates to life expectancy. There have been improvements in the last 6 decades, but clearly still progress needs to be made. And just going across these 6 different depictions here, you see poverty rates for African Americans fell in the 1960s, but continue to be higher than white peers over time. The gap continues. Median wealth for African Americans, we've mentioned earlier, is significantly lower for African American households. College completion rates are lower for African Americans since 1960 as well. You see home ownership play in. African Americans are less likely to own homes than white counterparts. And then single parent households also is a socio-demographic evidence of some oppression that occurs when almost 50% of households are single parent for African Americans. That number is much lower for white family households. And then the one that's most telling is the life expectancy. You'll see African American life expectancy trail that of white peers, and that goes to whether African Americans have the same access to health care, to employment, to good food sources and clean water, all play into life expectancy outcomes. And for those to trail for an entire population is very concerning. There's legal evidence of oppression since 1960, and we will focus primarily on the criminal justice system. Some startling statistics here. Currently, nearly 1 out of 3 young Black men will spend time in prison during his lifetime. That figure rises to nearly 60% among young African American high school dropouts. That's startling. There are discriminatory criminal justice policies and practices that have historically and unjustifiably targeted Black people since the Reconstruction era to capitalize on a loophole in the 13th Amendment. That states citizens cannot be enslaved unless convicted of a crime. You have Black codes, vagrancy laws, and convict leasing that were all used to continue post-slavery control over newly freed people. High arrest and incarceration rates of African Americans based on these racist policies deeply informed national discussions about racial differences that continue to this day. These biases by decision makers at all stages of the justice process disadvantage African Americans. Studies have found that they're more likely to be stopped by police, detained pre-trial, charged with more serious crimes, and sentenced more harshly than white people. A 2013 study found that federal prosecutors are more likely to charge African Americans than similarly situated white people with offenses that carry higher mandatory minimum sentences. Clear evidence of oppression in our criminal justice system. And with that, we conclude some of the evidence of oppression that we've seen since 1960. Thank you.